Welcome, everyone. It is once again Fellowship Friday, and today we're going to be talking about personal statements. If this is your first time, twice a year, the Office of National Scholarships Advisement does a four-part Fellowships Friday series because we are fond of alliteration. We are extra excited in the spring because that means we get to do it in February. So triple alliteration. So joining me today is a good chunk of the staff. My name is Kyle Mox. I'm Associate Dean and Director of ONSA. Joining me as well is Dr. Levin, who is, I think, going to be joining us in silence.
Hi everyone. I have a bit of a cold, so I'm going to be muted in case of coughing fits, but great to see you all here. Great to talk about personal statements. I'm a faculty member at Barrett and the ONSA Fellow
Great.
for Barrett.
And thank you. And Dr. Hauser.
Hi, everyone. Great to see you all again. Glad to see some familiar faces. I'm Dr. Mitch Hobbsa, Senior Program Manager for Distinguished Graduate Fellowships here at ONSA.
Great. And Katie.
Hey everyone, good to see you. Katie here. I'm a program manager of Global Awards at ONSA. I work primarily with the Fulbright U.S. Student Program and DOPRISE.
Well, wonderful. Today is going to be a general introduction to a lot of our theory about personal statements. And it's not intended to be a deep dive, but the fun thing is if you find this information useful and you want to see it applied in action, next week, we're going to be following this up with a part two, very dramatic. That'll be actually what we call a simulation, wherein we ask you all to play the role of one of the selection committee members, and you will get to evaluate and read some personal statements based on what we learned this week. So it's a fun exercise, and it's certainly cathartic if you're tired of being the person who's constantly evaluated and be the evaluator. So today's key takeaways, we are going to be talking about the personal statement and helping, first you must understand that these are crucial to every fellowship application. I can only think of one fellowship that does not include a personal statement, and that one actually includes a video in lieu of a statement. So there's always going to be a point at which in the application you need to talk about yourself and your aspirations, can't get around it. They are difficult to write. We don't do this in class. We don't do this in any of our classes unless you take one of our classes, but you haven't, if you're a Barrett student, you didn't do this in human event. If you take creative writing classes, maybe get close, but otherwise you're writing policy briefs, lab reports, things like that. And you aren't asked a lot of the time to articulate what it is you want out of life. And we also hope you understand that you need to dedicate adequate time to this. As Dr. Hobbs is fond of saying, a lot of students turn in their first draft as a final draft, and that's not going to work with personal statements, right? There's no B- personal statement. Either you win the fellowship or you don't. And your odds of winning a fellowship in most cases are not great. And the way that we improve those odds is by dedicating a lot of time to a personal statement. So with that being said, what is it? Right. So we talk about it a lot. Generally it's a short personal essay, and we can unpack what that word essay means. Short, I think most of them are in the 500 to 1,000 word range. Can anybody think of one that's much longer than that? Which is not much.
The NSFGRP is 3 pages. That's
Three
about the
pages.
longest one.
Right. And that's for people applying for PhD. Right. And so we assume you have a lot to say. In most cases, in most of our class assignments, you're being asked to write to a minimum word count, which means that we've gotten very good at adding, let's call it fluff, filler, extra words or unnecessary ideas that help us get to that mandated minimum word count. In a fellowships application, you have the opposite issue where you have to stay within a word count and you have your whole life story to tell. So it's not a practice most of us are comfortable with. They're intended to reveal your interests, values, goals, and personal background. And the prompts will differ a little bit, but they're all some variation of to tell us about you and what you want out of life. And essentially, the application will have a resume or CV or a list of activities or something like that, but they want to know the person behind the data. So it's not going to be just a narration of your resume, but actually some kind of narrative of you. So people ask, what do I write about? That's it's a more complicated question than you might realize because you can't cover your life story in 500 or 800 words, right? You've got to pick and choose what elements are going to be the focus. Many times, our applicants want to know, okay, what do they want to hear? And this is what we always figure out in class, right? If I can just figure out what this professor is looking for or what this teacher likes, I can, unravel it. It's not a bad practice in all reality. We would like to think all of our professors are perfectly well calibrated in terms of their preferences, but we know this isn't true. The same thing goes for committee members. This is a known thing. The criteria are known to us. They are published. This is why we have jobs, is to help you find that out. And a lot of times we don't know how to start. And I think the worst way to start is just to sit down and start writing. It'll get you there, but it won't be fun and it may not be good. And we'll talk about in terms of tone and voice and style. This is not be an overly formal essay, but as well, it should not be too casual. And probably one of the most common events or questions that we get is, should I talk about blank, right? And in a lot of cases, the answer to that is, should I talk about this traumatic event that happened to me? It seems like everybody wants to know about that. I think we might unpack that a little bit later, but ONSA team, this is a question we get all the time. Do I have to talk about a big challenge or a setback or a trauma in my life every time I sit down to write a personal statement?
The answer to that is probably no. You don't generally have to. And I think what readers are really looking for when the prompt asks for a challenge is other kinds of challenges that applicants come across in their academic lives, in their personal lives, like an experiment failing in a lab, or something happening when you're a president of an organization and an event doesn't go in according to plan, and you have to think really quickly and problem solve, right? So really, in most cases, when they're asking for you to report on a challenge, they generally want to know about your ability to problem solve, to adapt, to be flexible. And so there are many ways for you to describe that without necessarily having to describe a traumatic event in your life.
Yeah, I might say too, is that the personal statement, from my perspective, is an opportunity to tell them something that they can't glean from other parts of your application. And so because you only have maybe a page, you want to be very intentional and thoughtful about what you want to share with them and what you want to prioritize, right? The prompt will ask you, tell me everything about your life, but in reality, you'll have to pick and choose, right? And that's why I say, if you want to choose a story, make sure it's something that really puts the rest of your application in context.
Yeah, exactly right. And, in terms of your pile of potential content, they might want to know about, why do you do any of this? We've seen what you do. We've seen the impact of what you do, but why? Why do you do this? And so maybe there's a narrative or a story about an incident or a series of incidents in your life that led you to having this strong interest in ultimate knitting or whatever it is that you do. Some of the things on your resume may not be self-explanatory. Maybe you've got to unpack them a little bit and kind of get at the nuance as to why this was so significant. And so that's really important. Probably the most difficult part, I don't think a lot of people struggle with the personal background because you've thought a lot about where you come from. But the future plans, right? All of us struggle with what's going to be happening 5 and 10 years from now. Everyone in ONSA, has the same problems you do. We don't know where we'll be in 10 years, but in the make-believe world of these fellowship applications, you have to have a very clear plan because they want to know, am I investing my money in a good bet, right? We're going to see a return on this investment because this person has a clear plan. And oddly enough, kind of the opposite question of the trauma dumping, if there's any irregularities in your record. So ONSA staff, this is one we deal with a lot, right? Maybe a student's got like two or three semesters of medical withdrawal, or they had a semester where their GPA kind of went sideways, or maybe there's a gap in their resume. How do we deal with that? And why would we want to write about that when we are trying to present our best foot,
I think that because you don't if that is something that happened to you, you definitely don't want to count yourself out. You might still be, an incredible applicant for this opportunity. But it is you want to address it, and you want to be thoughtful about how you address it and what, you don't have to tell the entire story of it. That shouldn't be your entire personal statement. But when committees are looking for and comparing candidates, right? They try to look holistically, and if they're looking and there's an irregularity, somebody might, say like, well, here's a way that we can distinguish these two candidates. But if you've addressed that irregularity, then they can be more confident in your ability to succeed in whatever opportunity you're applying for.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. If you don't say anything at all, they're just going to make assumptions, and we don't want that. I've worked with many candidates. We've gotten far through the process where it's like, oh, I was just looking at your transcript. You probably should explain the semester where all your grades went down and then came back up. Like, oh yeah, well, I was working 3 jobs, and then my father was in the hospital, and I was like, well, if this fellowship is looking for resilience and adaptability and your ability to work through multiple challenges, I think that's probably something we could work into the narrative. You're not seeking pity. You're just very succinctly and directly explaining something that might give them cause to pause. So, uh, one of the problems that most people have with any writing project, myself included, is getting started. There's nothing more intimidating than a blank page, which is why I like to just get words out as quickly as possible because it's much easier to revise than it is to write. So, we apply the principle of mise en place, which is a fancy cooking term that means get all your stuff ready before you start cooking. And I'm sure you've all cooked with the person who doesn't do that, where they've got eggs burning on the stove, but then they're looking around for where the pepper is. And oh, by the way, we're out of milk. Um, so we want to get everything ready when time comes for us to start assembling this thing. So, get everything, all your raw materials, and by everything we mean, all the potential content, and we'll talk about how to generate that in a second. But understanding the purpose, meaning what is this fellowship trying to achieve? What is its mission? What is its vision? How do they talk about themselves? What seems important to them? Who are they looking for based on what they've put on their website? Understanding the audience, so not just what are the eligibility criteria, what's the mission of this program, but what are the ways in which they go about selecting candidates. If they have this published, let me look at previous winners of this. Do I notice any trends or commonalities among these folks? Gives us a glimpse into the audience. And we in the office might know a little something about the people actually survey. Maybe we've observed committees. Dr. Habza, Kate, and we've all at one point or another served on review committees for national scholarships. And so that's a great way for us to become experts in how the audience actually responds to what you're writing. So get all your raw materials together, get what you need to write, and get moving.
I might add in on the part about audience, Dr. Mox. It's that so often when we work with students, I ask, like, imagine your audience, like, who's actually reading this and where are they reading this?
Yes.
And that's kind of a game changer because I think a lot of people think, oh, they're, in an office somewhere and it's 9 a.m. and a fresh cup of coffee. No, most of these readers are volunteers. They're reading this very quickly. They're given very little time. They're trying to make decisions very rapidly. And so our goal when we're writing is making their job super easy to say yes as well. And so oftentimes people think, oh, I want to have this great flourish at the end. Most of the time, actually, you want to put all the important stuff up at the top, either at the top of paragraphs, in the beginning, in the intros, and that can help you make decisions too about how you want to craft your essay and what stories you want to prioritize when you're sitting down and writing.
Mm-hmm.
Because technically, they don't have to read it all the way through. If they are bored or they don't find what they're looking for, it's not a professor, they're not grading you. Unfortunately, that is the reality of being a reader, of having to read a lot of applications very quickly. So I think that is something too that is different from when we think about writing other genres and essays of how the personal statement is different.
That's a really good point. And Katie's exactly right that they're under no obligation to read every word that you wrote. They might quit when they get the answer they're looking for. They might quit when they're bored. They might put you to the bottom of the pile because like, oh, I just can't right now. And so you want to be sure that you're doing everything you can to make this easy and they make them want to stay and read.
I will say that on the other hand, even though, when I've been on these, like I've been in rooms with, and some people do read it really carefully and like, despite the fact that they're volunteers. So you also don't want to, I don't know, count on people not reading the whole thing.
Right.
But I think Katie's absolutely right that like that idea of saving like your strongest point about yourself as like an ending. You still want to end strong, but you do want to like front load a lot of like, things that are absolute, must get across points.
Yeah.
That's exactly how I describe it too, is it has to bear to scrutiny if they're reading it closely, but it also has to be quickly skimmable. And I think one other thing I'll just add that we didn't quite touch on is you might not know you might not be in the field that your audience is in. So they might not be in your field. So you also don't want to get too technical or jargon laden in your descriptions of your research because you might be writing broadly to a broad academic audience. So every audience for every award is going to be a little bit different too, and what their expectations are.
Right. Really good point. And so that's a question to ask us as you sit down to prepare, like how technical is this audience? Who are the people that are likely reading this? How do I need to pitch this? This meme here, and in ONSA, we love memes. It's how we cope. So many times, and we've all, any of us who have taught writing, have heard a student say at some point, "Oh, I'm not worried. I do my best writing under pressure," which I'm going to assume is a fallacy because it's unlikely that they've tested the opposite hypothesis, right? You would be surprised if you just hear us out and sit down to prepare for a writing task 6 or 8 weeks ahead of when it's due. You have done good enough writing, is what we call it in writing circles, right? It was good enough to get a B minus. But as I pointed out at the beginning, there's no such thing as good enough writing in fellowships. Either you win or you don't. And so the longer you spend on this, more likely it is that you're going to tell a fellow, an essay or a narrative that represents you well. As Octavia Butler, who is a fantastic science fiction author, if you haven't read her, you should. But you don't start out writing the good stuff. You start out writing crap and thinking it's good stuff, and then gradually you get better at it. That's why I say one of the most valuable traits is persistence. And Katie says this time and time again. There is no such thing as writing talent, but persistence is actually what makes good writers. So the phrase we like to use is decoding the application. There's gaps sometimes between what is the signifier and what is signified, if we put it in theoretical terms, meaning what is it they put out front, and then what's the gap between what's the actual truth. And so as a team, what are some of the key things we look at when we're decoding an application with a student?
I guess first we want to make sure we're eligible to apply to the opportunity.
Probably got a good thing.
Always read the eligibility, requirements, and we read through a lot of these. Sometimes they're very dense language, so we're always happy to talk you through the eligibility requirements as well if you can't quite figure out whether you're eligible for an opportunity or if it's the right time to apply.
And let me add that these are non-negotiable as well. A lot of students think that maybe they just ask, or maybe we could just try. No. What federal agencies and these very competitive fellowships, publish, that is what it is. So.
I might say most of these fellowships or any program, they have these very abstract terms. They might have like adaptability, flexibility if it's Fulbright. If you apply to like graduate scholarships, for example, they'll say, research, service, and academics. And so I think when we're thinking of the audience and the situation and all of that, we can start taking these abstract concepts and start thinking about concrete examples, stories, things that might filter down into those abstract concepts that can actually showcase how that is. Those are going to be our vehicles for actually showing the readers how that is being exemplified in our daily lives. And I think that's a nice way to think of like filtering it down when you start sitting down and thinking about the application. So you're just like, I have this random memory from kindergarten, right? Well, how does that actually filter into one of the criteria that we're looking for? I think that can help actually drown out the noise and focus our attention on things a little bit faster.
Yeah, I think definitely coming up with categories based on the selection criteria. So if they are looking for adaptability, great, let's talk about that. I put academic excellence in the chat because that's one we see all over the place. And in some cases, they have a number in mind. And even if they don't, like the results show that they have a number in mind. But there are many other ways to show academic excellence. And so you might want to start thinking about your research output, or you presented at conferences, or a great paper or project that you did, examples that go beyond the transcript, right? That's probably the most common abstract criterion I see is academic achievement or academic excellence. So what are the readers looking for? Difficult to generalize, because every program has its own specific selection criteria. And as somebody who has sat on several different committees, Most of these fellowship sponsors go to great lengths to train and calibrate their readers to make sure that they are selecting the candidates that they want for their cohort. And so it is not as random as it might seem, but they want to know, what's important to you. What do you value? What sort of person are you? How do you look at the world? What's your perspective? What are what motivates you to do all of this stuff? And, for some of these awards, like the end goal might be fairly niche. There's awards specifically for people that want to go into the foreign service. There's awards specifically that want to go into tribal public health, right? And those are not wide fields. And so they'd like to know, how did you choose this pathway? Like I said at the beginning, they want to know where you think you're going, how you've tried to get there, and most importantly, how this award will help you do that. And I think these are the last two things are things that applicants tend to leave out quite often. Maybe they have a strong aspiration to be an exotic zoo vet, but they haven't taken any of the courses and they've not done any internships. And lastly, they fail to explain how a specific award is the through line in this narrative, right? This will help accelerate them towards that goal. Any other?
And oh, sorry,
yeah.
Dr.
No, I was inviting any other commentary on that.
Yeah, I think I was just going to add on because on the last slide, we were talking about context and situation. And part of the context and situation of any application is the mission of the award. So as Dr. Mox was just describing, it's so important to describe how an award is going to get you there. So you can't submit the same personal statement for multiple different applications. All those personal statements should be personalized to the mission of the award. And they should demonstrate that you can fulfill the mission of the award, but also that the mission of the award aligns with your own values. So it's demonstrating a reciprocal nature between you and the award that you're applying to.
Absolutely. So we talked about gathering ingredients, right? And the ingredients here will be your own thoughts and ideas and life experiences. It's just, terabytes worth of information. So you've got to figure out, how do I narrow this down? And so we've got a number of different pre-writing exercises that we've used with applicants in various contexts. I just threw a link to a Google folder that actually has most of these exercises in there. And so some of you might have done these before. My personal favorite's the personal inventory. And it's really just a simple series of questions that get increasingly complex or deep, I should say, and start to unpack your life a little bit. And so what I imagine is like you're taking your life experiences and putting them on a shelf so you can stand back and look at them. And so you've got this sort of pantry now that you can pick and choose what you want from that, rather than just saying, ever since I was in kindergarten, which is not a great way to start a personal statement. The obsession genogram is a really fun one. It's a little more complicated, but if you're aware what a genogram is, it's a way in which we might trace hereditary qualities. Like if we're trying to trace disease or something like that, we're looking at sort of a three-dimensional or two-dimensional non-linear web of connection to different ideas. But in this case, you're not going to be doing your relatives. You'll be doing your various obsessions, right? And try to think, how do all my different obsessions relate to one another? The one true sentence is a fun thing to do, as well as the 6-word memoir, to try to just tell your life story in 6 words or less, right? All of these different exercises have been really great ways to generate ideas to get you started. So do you all have any favorite ones that you use ONSA staff that, I haven't listed here? Or?
I don't think so. There's not anyone's listed here. I really like asking people to write a mission statement. That's probably one of my favorite ways to put it, is like, what is your mission? What are you going forward to do? What are you trying to fulfill?
Yeah. And, when I first got started doing this sort of work, the best guidance I got from a mentor was, as he worked with students, he would say, keep these personal statements, and years from now, you'll pull them out and look at them, because they should be mission statements. And you can look at the personal statement you wrote 5 or 10 years ago and either say, I'm still on my mission, or I'm not doing this at all. And that means one of two things. Either you need to reframe your mission, or you need to get back on mission, one or the other, right? And so I think it's a really useful way to sort of capture in time, what it is you're trying to become. So free writing is a great way to start, even though we said the worst thing you can do is just sitting down to start writing. What we mean by that is, okay, indent first paragraph. Let me start with my introduction, and then I'll write my second paragraph. No, I think really we just need to unhinge the inner critic, not evaluate it all, and kind of let our subconscious roam free. And The best way to do this is simply set a timer for 4, 5, 8, no more than 10 minutes. Once you've done this for 10 minutes, you realize free writing sucks up time pretty quickly. Uh, Disengage revision and editing from the generation process, right? We're trying to generate ideas at first, and you go back to what you're free writing and start to circle things that look interesting or promising. Look at your pre-writing exercises, start to connect things, make it messy, right? The messier, the better. Some of the best, and I love it when students share their pre-writing exercises with us. I like ones that are color coded or just sloppy or just like, there aren't even really complete sentences, because we haven't invested a lot of higher level thought in this yet. We're just trying to get down in the basement. And so, silence your inner critic. There's no such thing as a bad idea at this stage of the game. Do commit to multiple drafts. ONSA team, how many drafts for the various awards you work with do you typically see from a committed applicant?
7 to 8 to 9 to 10.
I say 7 to 10, depending on how long you have. Usually, like a application for DOT, it's 6 weeks. I'd say the average is maybe 3 to 4. For an application that's longer than that, typically 7. I will say on the pre-writing thing, sometimes the actual sitting down and writing part is quite intimidating. I have found actually doing voice notes on my phone can be a good way to start. Sometimes I'll be driving and I'll just start talking through it, do a timeline or just babble. And you can actually have in both Google Docs and if you have Zoom, you can actually play it back and it'll create a transcript for you. And that might be it for those who are maybe more auditory or verbal, that like to get started and just gab. I think sometimes that can be a helpful starting point too, if sitting down and actually typing is very intimidating to you. I've gotten some of my best starting points for essays and stuff like that from just talking to myself in the car and telling stories to myself. And it's actually quite fun.
Yeah. Yeah. In the personal inventory, actually, one of the questions it asks is, what's your learning style, right? And there's kind of the conventional learning styles of auditory, visual, kinetic thing. I'm more visual and kinetic, and I like moving the words around on a page. I like the act of typing. It helps me think. I need to touch something. I can't dictate. It's been disastrous trying to dictate. So the 7, 8, 9, 10, or 11 drafts is not a magic number. Just because you do them doesn't mean it's a good essay, right? And when you do them, if you write 7 drafts in 7 days, you've kind of missed the point as well, because there has to be time for reflection between the drafts. You have to have time to walk away from it. Stare out the car window, stare out the bus window. If you don't ride the bus, that's a great way to get a lot of writing done, is just staring out the window of a bus. But each time you come back to a new draft, don't just start at the beginning and go all the way through. Say, okay, well, this time I'm really going to focus on, I need transitions here. I need topic sentences so I can see what's happening. Or, you know what, that middle paragraph, I just don't like it. Let me focus on that this time. And so rather than trying to do a total overall every time, which gets exhausting, especially if you're working with one of us, we might highlight, okay, for your next draft, I would really forget about the introduction. We'll come back to it later, but you really just need to add structure to this by, integrating some topic sentences. Let's do that. And, separating revision and editing, nothing's more frustrating to me than when I share a draft with somebody and they say, oh, you misspelled that, or you're missing a word there. I'm like, I know it's the second draft. I'm not worried about it yet, right? It's like saying, well, I don't like the color of these walls. And like, well, we're knocking it down, so it really doesn't matter. And so keeping the revision, which has to do with restructuring, generating new content, adding in new ideas, removing ideas from the actual cleaning up of the language, and that'll make your life much better. Yeah, set aside your expectations of perfection, because you could always edit a bad page. You can't edit a blank page, right? We've got to have writing to get started. And so I think a lot of times when I tell students, we meet for a fellowship, maybe it's the second meeting or so, I say, all right, well, go ahead and get me something, and they're like, oh yeah, I'm working on something. I'm just going to, touch it up a little bit more. I just want it perfect before I send it to you. I'm like, dear God, why? If you're going to send me a perfect essay, in your mind, a perfect essay, you're going to be utterly crushed when I send it back to you, because I promise you, there's going to be comments, right? There's going to be suggestions. So if you think I'm going to stamp it with a smiley face and put an A on it, that's not how this works exactly. So we all have our different approaches to working with students. How ONSA staff, how do you work with a student where you can tell they're like, kind of dragging feet getting started, or what think they're going to sit down on a weekend and crush this in one draft?
I think advising appointments are great conversation starters with students who don't know where to start, or I think as writers, we get stuck sometimes thinking, well, what's relevant? And we often find our own stories maybe a little boring or uninspiring, or just, we don't think of ourselves as inspiring people sometimes. And it takes a conversation with someone else to think that it's interesting and see what kind of stands out. So I love using the transcript option on Zoom. I love just saying like, hey, tell me a story. Let's talk about examples. Tell me about a time when ... And then based off of that, we might open up a Google Doc together and start outlining something. And I think outlines can be very helpful to see just an overall structure of a story of where you want to take it.
I think two pieces of advice that I like to give applicants in early drafting stages is I think it's really useful to have a conversation after a first draft rather than just sending something in for written feedback. I think it allows us to ask a lot more questions, to learn how you feel about a draft. But I also think it's really helpful to actually put comments on your drafts about what your concerns are, what questions you have about the draft, because that gives us more to interact with when we're giving you feedback on your application materials, rather than just getting a draft and we're just like, okay, I don't know how you feel about this. Maybe you don't like the introduction to this. And that's actually helpful to me when I'm reading it to know that you're unsure about something, because then we can provide more specific guidance for those concerns. So conversations and leaving comments for us give us a lot more to engage with than just the writing itself.
Yeah, absolutely. That's one of the first questions I ask when we're doing a draft review is, okay, so what are you most concerned with in this draft, or what's giving you the most trouble? And conversely, what do you think is working well? What do you like in this? And because we want to know what we can keep and what we can build on, as opposed to, okay, that's got to go. But yeah, definitely, I think one of the most helpful things that I do as an advisor is just helping see the structure within that. Applicants and writers tend to have trouble seeing what the structure is, and I find that's what I get the most gratitude for is helping pull that out. So shifting gears a little bit, as we get through the process and we start getting into the latter stages, we want to be focused on the language itself. And so, when we're writing fellowships applications, we want to be writing in a relaxed but professional voice. Something that sounds like you, something that sounds like the way you talk. And I used to say this all the time to students when I began teaching. I began teaching in New Orleans, so I actually amended it to say, you should write the way you should talk. Because if you've ever been to New Orleans, writing how you talk probably wouldn't work too well. First person, yeah, it's okay to use I. We get this question all the time because your high school English teachers have pummeled you with this. I felt bad. I helped my son, and he's a senior in high school. I helped him with one of his essays, and he got points taken away from you for using personal pronouns. And we were using we, which is something that we do in professional academic writing, right? Because we're talking about a discourse community, and she marked it down. And I had to promise I wouldn't go up to the school and have a chat with her. But clarity and concision is key, right? If you think back to where we started and talking about, these people are volunteers, they're sitting there on their own time, they may or may not be getting paid for this. They don't have time to mess about. And so you have to use the smallest number of words to express the maximum number of ideas. And that is more difficult than it sounds, right? Also consider that you're telling a life story within a very confined space. And so you have to learn how to write with clarity and concision. A lot of that comes from using concrete nouns, avoiding abstract nouns, making sure that we're using active verbs, staying away from less active verbs. Anything to be, any conjugation of to be is to be avoided. Concrete specific nouns will give life and vigor to your sentences. And always, always, always using specific examples to illustrate your claims. Any other tips to add to that in terms of general advice you give to people, like what is good style in a fellowships application?
This is something that I learned in my creative writing, but this is ways to liven up your writing, especially if you do like an anecdote. I like thinking about the five senses, how you're engaging in the five senses, and how you can also subvert the five senses. So if you're talking about a pineapple, maybe instead of talking about how it tastes or smells, maybe you talk about how it felt in your hands, like the texture of it. And those are like little details that can be very concise, very vivid, and very memorable as well. So that's something that can be a fun way to play with your writing as you're thinking about anecdotes or experiences that you're trying to share with your reader.
Something that I borrow from Katie all the time is to show yourself making choices and show yourself having agency and taking action. So don't just describe what has happened to you, but show yourself in action and describe what you did in those situations that you're describing.
I have another handout for you. This is a handout I've started giving applicants as we get towards the last draft or two. Um, there's a lot of very small, not commonly known things that you can do to really tighten up the writing in these spaces. Things like avoiding gerunds. Like not a lot of people could identify what a gerund is, or how to avoid wordiness in general, which is the most common problem we see. Because when we want to sound intelligent, we try to really reach for those words, and you shouldn't be using words that you wouldn't use in day-to-day conversation. Um, I can tell English majors, and I can say this as an English major in college, they have all the words and they want to show them all to you, right? And so try to avoid sounding smart. You'll be seen as much smarter if you can express how dark matter works to a 10-year-old. That's difficult to do, right? In plain English. One of the favorite apps I like to use is the Upgoer, what is it, the Upgoer 5000, the Upgoer 10,000. But it's actually an AI app that forces you to explain your research only using the 10,000 most common words in English. It's very difficult to do. So, also avoid, remember, we said this is not a resume dump. Don't exaggerate your achievements. Being detailed doesn't mean adding adjectives or adverbs, heaven forbid that. So, we don't want to use a lot of extravagant superlatives. That doesn't make your writing more exciting. It just makes it more wordy. And avoid being generic. And by generic, we mean, could any other applicant have said this and it still be true? Or could you have said this about any other country or any other university or any other blank and it still be true? And a lot of times in our first couple of drafts, it's generic because you are a person and there are other people applying and we all kind of start at the same point, but we have to move away from that over time. Cliches are cliches because they're true. I was just working with an applicant earlier today who's applying for an award that's sponsored by the National Geographic Society. And she was gushing, as I was, because both of us have been obsessed with National Geographic since we were small. She's like, do you think that would be cliche of me to say that? I'm like, well, considering the other people in the applicant pool, I guarantee you 90% of the other applicants would probably say the same thing. Does that mean it's untrue? No, it just doesn't make you stand out from the crowd. So that type of thinking, it can be a good experiment. The personal inventory does it a little bit in terms of asking you, what do you have in common with people your age? What do you think you have? In what ways are you different than other people your age? And any kind of reasonable person, like, oh, why do you want to apply for this award that funds an entire year abroad? Like, oh, I want to get outside of my comfort zone. I want to see the world. I want to expand my horizons. I want to interact with other cultures. Like any rational person would probably give those same reasons. The joke we always make about, especially for NSF, Dr. Hobbs, is science majors tend to like to explain to you how curious they were as children. That's how one becomes a scientist. Like we think it would be amazing if somebody could write an essay about how they were incurious as a child, like they were really apathetic and didn't have any curiosity about how their mother's stand mixer worked at all. And that would be an unusual story, right? And the kind of values that most people have, and I think again, all these things can be true, but also not that memorable because they're common, right? There are a lot of cliches that pop up in writing. And I would say this is probably one of the best reasons not to take everything generative AI gives you without examining it. Because it is by its nature using large language models looking at a lot of writing, and a lot of writing is full of cliches and worn out phrases. And so I can spot an AI written thing pretty easily because it's full of these things. If I see the word unwavering one more time, I've banned it. I've banned that word. Cliches can be context specific and oftentimes result from you not being critical or thinking about your audience. So ONSA staff, what are maybe some context specific cliches you've seen or other words or phrases that you'd just like to not ever see again?
I have always been ...
Yep.
Yeah.
I think you already touched on this, Dr. Mox, but starting with that childhood story. Ever since I was 5, I've been interested in science. And it's like, be much more interesting to say, ever since I was 5, I've had dreams where I was trapped in a labyrinth, and that caused me to want to be an architect. That's interesting. I want to learn more about that, right?
Right.
So childhood stories aren't always necessarily cliche, but saying that you've always wanted to be in a certain occupation since you were a child is generally cliche.
Yeah, I want to know the next sentence after that labyrinth story, right? I want to keep reading. Hey, look at that. They predicted all the cliches I had on the next slide. I've always, ever since I was a child, I've always, and that's not true. You have not always, right? You probably when you were 6, you wanted to be an astronaut or a cowboy or something like that. I don't know. Or drive a lot of little kids that age want to drive a garbage truck for some reason. They think they're cool. Um, and if, when people say, well, growing up, I had a typical childhood, I'm like, great, let's skip it and go on to the part that's interesting then. If you're telling me that something's not that interesting, and then proceed to tell me about it. And then passion, right? We joke that I banned this word, and yeah, it doesn't mean you can't work it into your essay, but to me, you shouldn't have to tell me. When we read your personal statement and look at your application as a whole, it should be abundantly clear that you are passionate about this topic. And I think it's okay to not be passionate about everything you spend your time on. I think our culture has made it so that if you're not passionate about what you do, then why are you even wasting your time? Like, well, maybe you feel a strong compulsion to do this because you know it provides value to society. Maybe you have a great passion for aerial silks, but you're not going to elevate people out of poverty with that. That's just something you do to pursue your passions in your spare time. So, at any rate, the other types of cliches that we see are just what we call strategic cliches, meaning cliche approaches to the writing situation. The most common of which we mentioned already is starting at the very beginning. If you watch movies, as many of us do, rarely does a movie start when the protagonist is 5 years old and then works all the way up through the present, right? We start as close to the exciting or interesting, but think all of the Fast and Furious movies, or at least how I've never seen one. So I'm assuming that they all start with some sort of explosive car chase. A lot of action movies start with an exciting scene that grips you and wants you to say, what's going to happen? Why are we here? How did we get here? Right? I'm not telling you to have explosions in your first paragraph, but think, is there a turning point? Is there an inciting incident? Is there a key moment that I could actually use as the starting point, and then as necessary, fill in the key details? A lot of times we've been told or learned somewhere that we have to start with a hook. Yeah, I mean, again, Gen AI is probably going to steer you towards that as well, as having some sort of hook at the beginning, usually a rhetorical question, which I'm allergic to. Please don't do that. Pointless narrative anecdotes where we just tell a story just because we've been told that we need to tell a story at the beginning. That's one way to do it. There are many ways to do it. In many cases, I like people just to start by talking about the problem to be solved here. Help me understand what the key issue is, and then let's talk about what actions we can take. I'm ready to go now. But at any rate, other strategically, cliche, I'm not sure how to phrase this, but other cliches we see in terms of strategic approaches to personal statements. Excuse me.
Yeah, I think the chronological organization, certainly you can tell things in the order they happened if you wish. I just think that with personal statements, a lot of students, that's how they feel like they should write it. And actually, even though you only have 500 words, there's a tremendous amount of flexibility of how you tell your story. And you can use flashbacks, you can use flash forwards, you can sprinkle in information all throughout. You can do a couple different stories put together with a theme, right? Like you guys have like way more creativity and flexibility in this genre than you might even realize. So I encourage when you're in the pre-writing process to think about, okay, well, what if I actually started from the end of my story? What would happen? Would that cut out a lot of unnecessary things, or am I really tied to this particular moment or event that I want to tell in my personal story? So have fun with it. And I know in our advising sessions, we do that a lot. Dr. Mox and Dr. Hobbs and I like move around paragraphs like Tetris blocks and say, well, what if we started here instead? And that's a really fun exercise that we do when we're in advising. So have fun with it.
Yeah, I found quite commonly that, first, second, third draft, kind of like in the first third of the writing process, the beginning of the essay is actually buried usually about three paragraphs in, and the essay probably goes on 1 or 2 paragraphs longer than it needs to, right? So the ending's always before the ending, and the beginning's always after the beginning. In most cases, it's funny how common that is. But yeah, you have a ton of flexibility, right? There's a lot of different approaches you can take, and once you figure out, I find that's where the turning point really is in the writing process is once the applicant figures out, okay, here's the strategy I'm going to take, right? We talked about trauma and the obligation to write about it in application essays a little bit, but why you do what you do matters a lot more than what happened to you. You aren't what happened to you. Because the other trouble we get into is like we start to believe, and I've heard applicants say this, and in some cases, people feel like I have to tell a trauma story in order for them to pay attention to me. Everyone's got a trauma story, or I don't have a trauma story, they're not going to pay attention. That's not a competition you want to have, because I promise you, there's always somebody out there with a better story. It's yours, you own it, you choose what to do with it, right? Another thing to consider too is many of the fellowships come with it a nomination letter or endorsement letter. And we write those on behalf of the university. And that might be a place for us to handle it for you. And so we can work strategically to think about, okay, this is important. I think it's important that they know this about me, but it doesn't have to become the focus of the essay. Many times one sentence will do it. And, we love deadlines, right? Because they're non-negotiable. They're like a baby. They're coming with, whether you're ready for it or not. And, without deadlines, we could just be revising endlessly. And, Da Vinci once said, I used to think it was George Lucas, but he stole it like he did most things from Da Vinci, who said, a work of art is never completed, it's only abandoned. And so we abandon it. And so we don't call them final drafts, we call them submitted drafts. And many applicants said, oh, if I only had more time, fine. It'll never be absolutely perfect. But we hope it gets as close as possible to telling your authentic story, right? Which is what our goal is. So if you're not familiar with our website and our office, do take the time. We've got a scholarship database. You can look to browse through the 80 to 100 different awards that we provide advising on. When you're ready to schedule an appointment, you can do that through our website as well. And if you're not subscribed to our weekly bulletin, you should do that. The next big thing we're preparing for is the Fulbright U.S. Student Program. And so we have many different info sessions coming up right now. But for current juniors, seniors, and graduate students who are really thinking about, I want to go after one of these big awards, Fulbright is the most flexible and broadest program there. So you can come learn all about it on March 26th. And as you can see, our timeline is set up really well for a nice, well-developed writing process between March and October. So, well, let me pause there. We do have a couple of minutes, and we'd be happy to answer any questions you have. And you're welcome to pop them in chat, raise a hand, or simply unmute. We got a fairly small group here today.
Yeah, I might just add, thank you all for joining us today. This is always really fun to talk personal statements. If you weren't here with us in the beginning, we're doing a simulation next Friday. And that's where the juicy part really is, where we'll read through some personal statements. You guys get to be readers for these awards and we can discuss, and it's really fun. So please join us for the simulations. And also personal statements, of course, they're intimidating, but no one should have to do them alone. I think that's the best part of this process, is that we have an amazing community, and our offices, we're here to support that process of collaboration, talking with you to make sure that you feel like your draft is the best version it can be when you submit. So yeah, we're really excited to work with you all.
And I'll just add on to that. Like, I think I speak for everyone here. Someone can correct me, but like, this is the intellectual labor of our work that we really enjoy. We really enjoy working on personal statements with you all and helping you figure out those moments of discovery where you learn something about yourself. So don't feel intimidated about working on this with us. Like, this is something that we actively enjoy and are looking forward to working with you on.
No, you're accurate. I'm always amused when a student says, "Oh, I'm sorry to bother you, but," I'm like, do you say that when you take your car to the mechanic? Like, I'm really sorry to bother you, but my brakes are going out. Now, this is why we're here, right? This is what we're here to do. So, yeah, great question. Specifically about the Gilman. Would the Gilman essay need that many drafts? It takes as many as it takes, until you feel like, like this is nailing it. The Gilman Scholarship, for those of you who don't know, this is simply for study abroad for, students from many different categories who might not normally have the opportunity to study abroad. it's a pretty straightforward prompt, right? And this is probably one of the most straightforward essays out there, right? And I think the best thing an applicant can do is just simply talk about their motivations for wanting to study abroad, how it will help them become the person they want to become, and what are some key experiences that have created that motivation. Yeah, Katana asks about looking over personal statements. Yeah, we generally book appointments topically, meaning if you're working on a specific fellowship application that is in season, those appointments are available. And so if there's something you want advising on that is not available in our appointment menu, just reach out. Say, well, I know it's not in season right now, or I know it's not due till February, but and so just you can send it right to the general ONSA email or to one of us, and we can see if it's something that we can work with. We do get a lot of requests for people to look at graduate school, law school, medical school essays. Unfortunately, we just can't extend that service because we just simply don't have the staffing to do that. That's a pretty big task. Yep. Yeah, absolutely. Shay Masterson in our office is our lead Gilman advisor, and so she's actually was giving a presentation today. But absolutely, so we have a new feature where we have some last minute drop-in advising close to the deadline. I encourage you all to send drafts to Shay, though. She's fantastic, and you won't be disappointed. It goes without saying, Gilman is one of these awards, for those of you that don't know, that doesn't require nomination by the university. You can apply directly on your own. We get the list of who applied and who received the award, and unsurprisingly, people who have sent more than one draft to Shay for feedback have almost double the selection rate of those who don't. Should not be surprising. So, good. Any questions we missed? Great. Yeah, absolutely. So thank you all so much. And hope that you're curious to see. It's great to see some examples. We'll also have some real live examples for you next week if you want to return. And if anyone's watching this on recording before next week, by all means, come and check it out. Enjoy your Friday, enjoy your weekend. Those of you who have Monday off, fantastic. And hopefully see you all next week. To staff, thanks as always. Amazing truth drops all around.
Bye, everyone.